everyone to chesslecture.com. My name is International Master Bill Paschall. It's my pleasure today to bring you a new video presentation series on the Endgame. Knight versus Bishop, Part 1. Good Knight versus Bad Bishop. Today's featured game, we're looking at it from Black's point of view. Black played by Grandmaster Salo Floor, as you know, one of my favorites. Playing the white pieces, Elis Casas, also a strong player of his time. The game was played in 1937 in Semmering, Baden. Enjoy the game. So we take it from this endgame position. Floor has the ideal knight. Knight on d6 blockading the powerful white protected passed pawn at d5. As you might have seen in earlier chesslecture.com videos, the protected passed pawn is the strongest possible pawn in the endgame, or at any point in the game. It can never be captured. It's a passed pawn that cannot be captured upon its advance down the board, but it's also protected by the white pawn at e4. This is a big advantage for white, but it's not enough to offset black's advantages. Black has fixed the pawns in the center on the same color of white's bishop, the white square bishop on g2. That means that white has a bishop that's inhibited by its own pawns. The black pawn is at e5 and it's immune from the white pieces. There's no way for white to get at that black pawn on e5. Black's extra pawn on the queen side is the main reason he has a sizable advantage. He has a qualitative majority on the queen side. Qualitative and quantitative. White has a quantitative pawn majority in the center, but not a qualitative one. It's ineffectual because the pawn at d5 is completely immobilized. It might as well not be there. White cannot use that passed pawn as long as the knight is in the vicinity. But this position is not necessarily winning for black. Black is better. Black should under no circumstances ever lose the game. But it's not easy to convert this to a win because the protected passed pawn is such a strong piece. Let's see how the game went down. b5 from black, immediately advancing his queenside majority. He's playing on b5, a5. He'll control all the squares like a4, b4, c4, and d4. The white king will not be able to approach. Will not be able to approach at all. In the meantime, black is also going to prepare probably to bring his king, ideally, the zigzag line I've just drawn, to c5, somewhere around c5, where it can help to blockade the pawn at d5. So b5, king d2 from white, a5. After a5, keeping the white king out of these squares, white plays king d3, relieving the bishop from having to guard the e4 pawn. It's very important. You don't want your pieces to be tied down to pawns, but white has no choice here. This way his king can remain in a good position in the center, freeing his bishop for more active duty from d2. After king d3, the black king starts the march, king f6. And again, ideally he'd like to walk right down on the dark squares from f6 to d8 to b6 to c5, maybe walk right into a3 and help himself to that pawn at a2. This would be the easiest way to win the game, if allowed. So black starts moving with the king. King f6, bishop f3 from white, a move which really doesn't do anything. King e7. And now white makes an interesting move, which on the surface looks okay to me. h4. This goes hand in hand with the concept of putting the pawns on the opposite color of your bishop, which is what you're supposed to do in such endgames. So I don't think h4 in itself is any kind of a mistake. h4, h6 from black, preparing to put his own pawns on the dark squares with g5, if necessary. Of course, black can wait and see. White plays now bishop d1. Notice how the bishop is placed ideally where it can influence the most squares. Now the king starts walking again, king d8. Now an interesting move from white, a4. For me, this is a little bit strange. But he wants to blockade the position. Goes against the grain of normal strategy in such positions for several reasons. This move, in a way, helps black to create a passed pawn. It also fixes the black pawn on the wrong color. But the problem is, if black plays b4, he just may not be able to get through. See, sometimes in these endgames, the position becomes so blocked that you can't make progress with the superior side. So instead of playing b4, which would block the position too much, Floric exchanges on a4, creating a passed pawn. The only question, really, is how strong is white's protected passed pawn at d5? Will that keep black tied down to the point where he can't make progress? B takes a4, bishop takes a4, king c7, and the king starts the journey to b6, to c5, maybe to b4. After king c7, white played the waiting move, bishop to c2. Black continues to improve his king position, king to b6, king to c3. Notice, again, it's strong passed pawn for black against ineffectual passed pawn at d5 for white. And white is tied down to the e4 pawn. The one thing that white has going for him is that knights and outside pawns don't tend to go together very well. Generally, further outside passed pawns are best complemented by a bishop. So white has the bishop. It can be useful in stopping far outside passed pawns like this a pawn in this case. So white does have that going for him. Actually, if you have the knight against the bishop, you tend to want to have the pawns close together. Outside pawns don't work that well with knights. So now, after king to b6, king to c3, king to b5. Now with this move, Flor has several options. He can try to go up to a4. If white allows him, say plays bishop d3 check, we can go into a4 and try to help the pawn to move forward. Instead, white plays king to b3. He's trying to block the pawn with his king from going to a3. Now black played king c5, threatening king d4. But you have to remember one very key thing about this position. It's nice to just walk into d4 with your king and plan on eating the pawn at e4. But this is the problem with a protected passed pawn. The problem is we can't take it, because if you play king d4 and take the pawn at e4 with your knight, white exchanges bishop for knight, and then the white pawn simply clears and queens on d8. It may come to pass that h4 was a serious mistake for white. It didn't look like it because he was putting it on the right color, so to speak. But in the end, what's going to happen is white has weakened his pawn at g3. Instead of going for the pawn at e4, what black is going to do is go for the pawn at g3. And if that pawn was protected by a pawn at h2 at this point, black may well be unable to win the game. After king c5, white goes for the a pawn with king a4. This leaves his king way out of position. So black isn't planning on queening that a pawn. It's merely like a decoy. King a4 from white. Now knight c4, temporarily defending the a pawn. More importantly, threatening to get the knight over to either d2 or e3 to start attacking the queen side, or rather the king side, where the g3 pawn is a major weakness. So knight c4 using the a pawn as a decoy. Bishop to b3 from white, who's running out of moves here. But I think this is a clear mistake. He shouldn't leave the e4 pawn unprotected. If that pawn falls, white is definitely doomed. It was better to keep the bishop on this diagonal. So instead of bishop to b3, he should have played something like bishop to b1. Notice, you can't play bishop d3 because of knight b2 check, winning the bishop. But if white had played bishop to b1, keeping e4 guarded, black would have a hard time making progress, as it is in the game. After the move bishop to b3, for one thing, white has to worry about losing his e4 pawn. This is going to cost him time, if nothing else. Knight d2, see, now he has to waste time to go back with bishop c2. And this gives black time to get in there at the other pawns. After bishop c2, knight f1, attacking the pawn at g3. Now white is really in trouble. If he loses that pawn, his pieces are way out of position to stop black's new passed pawn on the king side. King takes a5, knight takes g3. And these pawns are going to be pretty fast, the black pawns on the king side. King a4 from white, knight h5. And I think that black is safely winning now. King to b3, king d4. And this reveals the real point of knight h5. Black had to bring that knight back so the knight can be used when the white pawn starts to advance. The king is now out of the box, so to speak, out of the box of the pawn, but the knight will take over the duty of stopping that pawn. After king d4, king to b4. White can't make up his mind what to do with the king, but really the position is basically lost. King b4, knight f6, again stopping the passed pawn. d6, g5. Now black has a strong passed pawn. Of course, black exchanges, or white exchanges rather, a takes g5, h takes g5, king b5, g4. Now white must stop that pawn. He must stop the pawn. So bishop d1, g3, and again he must stop the pawn with bishop f3. King e3, hitting the bishop. Bishop back to h1, an undesirable square, but still. It takes black some time to get in there and attack the bishop. King f2, king c6, g2, bishop takes g2, king takes g2. Now black is going to have just enough time to win this pawn at e4. At least he's going to have enough time to defend his own pawn at e5 and eventually win the e4 pawn by Zugzwang. d7, knight takes d7, king takes d7, king f3, and white resigned. The king and pawn game is simply lost. If we think about this game, we realize it was very tough for white to defend with such a bad bishop. The fact of the matter is, he lost because he played h4, which was a natural move according to general principles. Put the pawns on the opposite color of your bishop. But in a way, he violated another principle, which is don't create weaknesses in your position. Don't move the pawns without good reason. White may have been able to defend the position if he hadn't played h4. Nothing was threatening those pawns over on the king side. There was no reason that white had to play that move h4. But defense in such positions is very difficult. An instructive win by Salo Floor with a good knight versus bad bishop. This is International Master Bill Paschall signing off from this ChessLecture.com video presentation.